the International Secretary of the Haldane Society for Socialist Lawyers, and I think he's maybe a Hopi supporter. There's no socialist lawyer there, or at least maybe we can make it more convincing to do. But I'm sure we will convince him in the end. And then also Mike Macnair, who's also I don't know what you're a professor or whatever.
No, I'm a lecturer.
You're a lecturer in law and a Hopi supporter, Communist Party of Great Britain member. Okay, so Bill is going to speak first. I'm going to take the speakers for each 20 to 25 minutes and then open it up for discussion.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to be here this afternoon. Can I introduce to you also, somewhere at the back, my research assistant, Tom, who comes with me to conferences, so he will keep quiet, I think, at the back there. On the floor. But he's, he's well employed down there. So, can I say that a certain amount of what I'm going to say is in this book. I'm not saying that you have to rush out and buy it. I've left some leaflets at the back. If you are attached to an academic institution, get your library to order a copy. That is the thing. It doesn't actually. There's a hardback which costs £95, as you would expect. But the paperback costs £29.99. You see the way they market even books now. And I'm afraid to say that on very incorrect sites like Amazon, you can get it for about £25 plus postage. So, I don't know exactly how that works out. So it's not as bad as many of these things. So, having been given this title of War, Human Rights and Intervention, I thought I would address them in turn. So I have no idea at all what Mike is going to say, though I have read some of his work. So he will probably critique me seriously once I have finished. And I'll speak for about 20 minutes. So, can I say, in my opinion, war is either imperialist or a war of national liberation. I'm not sure that I'm aware of any other varieties of what a war might be. And I think a war of national liberation includes a war of self-defense in many cases. So that's what I think war is. I might return to that. On the question of human rights, I do have a take on human rights. And I disagree strongly with my colleague at Birkbeck, Costas Douzinas, who's written two books now, one called The End of Human Rights, and the other one called Human Rights and Empire. And so if you're interested in that kind of thing, you can have a look at them. I do disagree with him. He's what's called a postmodernist. I don't go along with that. Neither, though, do I go along with the idea that human rights is some kind of a new religion that we all have to subscribe to. And of course, human rights language is now used and abused by everybody for every possible purpose. So part of what I'm trying to do at the present time is to reclaim a different version of what human rights are. So I'm going to put this really extremely crudely in the following way, that the human rights that we presently talk about, in my opinion, are in three generations. The first generation are the civil and political rights, which you find in the French Revolution, Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, not women. And the second generation are social and economic rights. And the third generation are rights of interdependence, but in particular the right of peoples to self-determination, which I think is probably the key right of the 20th and 21st centuries. So just to say a few words about each of those. In Britain, we have recently moved into the 18th century, and Britain being the kind of country it is, this is quite an achievement. So we are now in the 18th century in Britain. That means that our law includes the first generation civil and political rights, starting with the right to private property, but including personal liberty, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of conscience. Those, if you like, first generation rights, which you find in the French and American revolutions of the end of the 18th century. They finally became part of English law in the year 2000. That's when I say we moved into the late 18th century in this country. And I just want to make the point briefly that human rights are nothing if they are not scandalous, in my view. And the first generation of rights were completely scandalous at the time. And they were scandalous in the view of three very different critics of that time. First one is Edmund Burke, who is the father of conservatism, as a matter of fact, an Irishman, probably the most thoughtful of conservative philosophers. And he firmly believed that the only freedom you can have is the freedom which comes out of a long organic process. And he thought that a list of rights was the best way to destroy everything and would end up with the guillotine and a lot of blood. So he wrote a long polemic along those lines. The second person is Jeremy Bentham, whose mummified remains you will find a couple of 100 yards away from here in University College London, where they keep him in a box. It's called his auto icon, and they get him out once a year for dinner. And they have a Bentham industry in University College London. Bentham...
Well, they find him indigestible.
And Bentham wrote that human rights are nonsense upon stilts. So they're not just ordinary nonsense, they are super nonsense. And what he was attacking was the idea of human rights as natural rights, as somehow universal, as somehow imprescriptible, so they couldn't be taken away from you. And the third thinker at that time was Karl Marx, and I thoroughly recommend the two texts by Marx on this question. One is the Jewish question, and where Marx actually was in that text as a whole, seeking to find the way that Jews could become fully members of society, in continental Europe in particular. And what he wrote about, and of course he had a special sense of society, which was species being, so he said human beings are nothing outside of humanity as a whole and society. And he said what human rights do, certainly those first generation human rights, is to take human beings out of society and turn them into egotistic, atomized people who want nothing to do with the rest of society, simply to be left alone to make money. So that's putting it a bit crudely, but that is more or less what Marx was saying in the Jewish question. So I'm saying these were scandalous.
And the second piece?
There's Burke, Bentham and Marx.
No, but you said Marx had two.
All right, the second was the critique of the Gotha program.
Oh, yeah.
In the critique of the Gotha program, he has a devastating critique of the idea of equality. And he says we simply are not equal. In this room, we are different ages, we have different levels of physical capacity and intelligence. He said that to talk about equality is complete nonsense. So, and actually he then develops what in his view would be the principle for distribution, for production and distribution under communism. So anyway, have a look at the text.
Yeah.
I get my students to read it, and it's a good one. It's just a few pages, and I think it's excellent. So, first generation. Marx wasn't around long enough to see the second generation, and the second generation I date to the Russian Revolution, and these are the social and economic rights, and they became legal rights as the response of the West to the Russian Revolution immediately after the First World War, 1919, with the creation of the International Labour Organization. By the way, in Britain, to this day, social and economic rights are anathema. We will have nothing to do with them in this country, and that is more or less true of the common law world, of the United States as well. So the idea of collective rights, we will have nothing to do with, and I won't go into any detail, but there is now a European system for collective complaints on social and economic rights, and that's complaints by trade unions, by NGOs and by other collective organisations. Britain will not touch that. That's why I say we're still in the 18th century. So we have a second generation, I like to call them red rights, of social and economic rights. And the third generation, if I take the first from the French Revolution and the American Revolution, second from the Russian Revolution, the third generation is dated around about 1960, and with the amazing decolonization struggles, which these days tend to get forgotten as far as possible. And as I said already, the key right is the right of peoples or nations to self-determination. That finally became a right in international law in 1966. As a matter of fact, thanks to a huge diplomatic effort by the USSR and its allies. And so I have written about this in the book, in another book called International Law from the Left, and a paper I gave 2 days ago at SOAS. If anyone wants to see it, I can send it to you. Mike now has a copy of it. And basically, what I'm saying there is that the right of nations to self-determination, that was developed not as students of international law are usually told by Woodrow Wilson, the American president at the end of the First World War, but by Vladimir Lenin. And this started out as a very fierce polemic within the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party at the time of the split between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and also in the continuing polemics with the Jewish Bund and with others, Rosa Luxemburg in particular. So Rosa Luxemburg and the Jewish Bund were in favour of not breaking up the big empires, the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, but keeping them as far as possible as a big space for the proletarian revolution. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, on the contrary, said that outside of Western Europe, it was absolutely essential to support unconditionally national liberation movements. And this was the right of nations to self-determination. And what I go into detail in the paper is the way that this was put into practice by Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the period after the Russian Revolution, in relation to Finland, the Baltics, Ukraine, and the last major conflict between Lenin and Stalin was over Georgia, because Stalin, as we know, maintained the Russian Empire at its full extent and bigger, whereas Lenin was absolutely in support of self-determination for the various component parts. And the crucial difference between Lenin and Woodrow Wilson was that Wilson confined self-determination to Central and Eastern Europe. Lenin very clearly had the colonial empires in his sights, and most of the world at that time was divided between the colonial empires. So this became, if you like, the key issue, I would say, in the post-Second World War period. And the anti-colonial struggles all over the world were the exemplification of the right of peoples to self-determination. That issue is not finished, as we know, with Palestine in particular. So that brings me straight to intervention. My personal opinion is that intervention is always a disaster. So intervention should always be opposed in every single case, whatever humanitarian or other argument is made in favour of it. And I think we see this so clearly now in example after example. But I also say that the principle of non-intervention follows directly from self-determination. How can a people self-determine if they are then going to be intervened upon? So it absolutely contradicts what is now seen to be, what is now recognised as a key principle, maybe the key principle of international law, as developed in struggle. So I would say on intervention, it's absolutely clear. Turning briefly in the last couple of minutes, if I have 3 or 4 minutes, to Iran. Okay. I actually do I take a lot of cases to the European Court of Human Rights. I took many, many cases on behalf of Kurds. I'm now taking over 100 cases on behalf of Chechens against Russia, and I've won about 25 of them. I've been thrown out of Russia twice, though I will be back there again next week, inshallah, as they say. And I'm taking several cases against Azerbaijan at the present moment on the Juma Mosque. This is the most ancient mosque in Baku, which is now being closed down and turned into a carpet shop because they refuse to be part of the state Muslim structure of Azerbaijan. However, travelling to Azerbaijan as I do, I'm aware, because I'm constantly reminded of it, of the fact that you have northern Azerbaijan and you have southern Azerbaijan. So I don't know if anyone has mentioned this previously in this weekend school, so now I will mention it if nobody else has. So if you're talking about non-intervention in Iran, so I'm 100% with you on that. But I would say that the democratic or revolutionary movements in Iran, so trade unionists, students and so on, you have to take account of the national situation of Iran. And I would just therefore remind you of a few key dates. The first one being 1828, the Turkmenchai Treaty between Persia and the Russian Empire. And the reason why we now have twice the number of Azerbaijanis in Iran than we have in Azerbaijan. So there's about 7 million in Azerbaijan and between 15 and 20 million in Iran. The reason for that is that a dirty deal was done between the Persian Empire and the Russian Empire, whereby the Russian Empire got to swallow up the northern part of, it wasn't Azerbaijan of course, but the territory where the Azerbaijanis have lived for a very long time. So the territory where they live was split into two. And I was reminded by doing some reading for today on your website and some other websites that the constitutional and democratic movement of 1905 to 1911 in Iran was to a great extent led from Tabriz by Azerbaijanis. And actually Azerbaijanis have played a very important role in the democratic movement in Iran. So I think, I may have got it wrong, but I think that is the case. And I think that when the Pahlavi regime came to power in 1925, what that meant was that what had previously been an accommodation of nationalities within Iran, Kurds, Turkmens, in particular Azeris, who are 25% of the population of Iran now, at least, that was brought to an abrupt end. Now, who was behind that? The British. And I'm astonished, you know, that the British are back in Afghanistan, having lost an entire army there under General Roberts at Kabul in the 19th century. That we're back in Iraq, having lost an entire army there in the interwar period. Now we seem to be poised on going into Iran, where actually we are responsible, I'm afraid to say, for a lot of, well, our predecessors in this country, for a lot of what is going on in that region. So I'm not calling for the dismemberment of Iran, not for a moment. What I am saying is that a democratic revolutionary movement in Iran has to take serious account of the fact that 25% of the population speak a totally different language, a Turkic language, not Farsi, and that is just one of a whole series, the Kurds, Turkmens and others. And I've just been 2 weeks ago in Ashgabat in Turkmenistan, and I was 20 minutes away from the Iranian border, teaching for a week, teaching international law for a week in Russian 3 hours a day, and I was the first foreign professor ever to be in the State University in Ashgabat since the Turkmen Bashi died just over a year ago. So I would just say that the overthrow of Mossadegh, of course in 1953, I think there's a continuum there, and I think what has happened to the nationalities within Iran is absolutely integrally linked to the role of imperialism in determining the fate of Iran. And the reason that the mullahs are in power at the present time in Iran, I think, has an awful lot to do with that history. So I think I leave it there. I've covered all three topics I was given briefly, and I hand over to Mike.
But you haven't said anything about the French.
About?
You have not said anything about the tussle between the Brits and the French.
Right, ask me a question in the... We'll have lots of time for questions.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Mike.
I look forward to that.
Okay. Mike Macnair, CPGB. I'm not going to call on academic credentials in this context because my academic credentials aren't really directly relevant to this context. I am, however, going to say that what I'm saying is my own views and not CPGB's views, in particular in relation to the question of national self-determination. I think it would be useful if Comrade John could intervene in the discussion on the question of national self-determination, because I don't think that our collective reading of Lenin on national self-determination is quite the same as yours. My starting point is that we should oppose the present regime of sanctions against Iran, and we should oppose any US, Allied or United Nations attack or intervention on Iran, and we should oppose any US military and financial support whereby the US takes over insurgent movements against the Iranian regime, any operations whereby the US sets up a coup or a velvet revolution controlled from Washington. We should oppose all this stuff, the starting point. And secondly, that we should oppose it even if, first we should oppose it even if it's proved to be the case that the theocratic regime is trying to get the bomb, even if the theocratic regime actually gets the bomb, even if the theocratic regime is proved to be supporting anti-American, quote, insurgents in Iraq, which, as I said previously, is terribly unlikely since they're actually supporting the American public government in Iraq. Even if the theocratic regime launches a preemptive military strike against US naval forces in the Gulf, or if it launches a preemptive military strike against Israel, even if the use of force or sanctions against, well, sanctions already been approved by the Security Council, even if an invasion is approved by the Security Council, even if an invasion is approved by the Security Council or bombing is approved by the Security Council and it's backed by the General Assembly, even if these bodies are unanimous in supporting US allied military attack on Iran, we should oppose it. So what I'm saying in effect is we should oppose it however legal it is. It seems to me that it's one of the confusions which has happened in the movement against the Iraq war, that people have opposed the Iraq war not on principled grounds but on the grounds that the Iraq war was illegal. Well, it clearly was the case. The Iraq war was blatantly, invasion of Iraq was blatantly illegal, was founded on lies, and quite clearly amounted to a war crime. But it's a trap to oppose the war on the basis that it's illegal, and that trap is that puts you in a position of, okay, so why don't you support the coming war on Iran, which will be legal? Probably, all that being legal in this context means is that the United States managed to bribe or coerce enough people to get itself resolutions backing it through the Security Council. Similarly, we should oppose a war on Iran in spite of the fact that the theocratic regime is tyrannical and denies what are currently understood to be human rights to its population. And we should oppose a war on Iran in spite of the fact that the theocratic regime is a Farsi Shiite sectarian regime which denies national self-determination to the Arab speakers of Khuzestan, to Baluchis, Azeris, Kurds. The list is undoubtedly, that list is certainly incomplete, was not intended to be complete. But just as that Iran is a prison house of nations like the Tsarist regime before 1917. The other side of this coin, so that the fact that the Iranian regime is antithetical to human rights, as human rights are commonly understood, and that it denies the right of self-determination, is not a reason why we should support or tolerate or accept or not oppose US-backed military operations against Iran. The other side of this coin, the fact that we oppose all military intervention against Iran is not in any way a reason for shutting up about the tyrannical character of the Iranian regime, and it's not in any way a reason for refusing to give political solidarity to the Iranian workers' movement and the people who are struggling against the tyrannical character of the Iranian regime. Back to my main point, no matter how legal an attack on Iran might be, no matter how much an attack on Iran might be spun and explained and justified as being that it's going to defend human rights, we should be against it. And if we're going to be against something which has legal backing, we can't be against it on the basis that it is a violation of international law. We have to find the means to discredit the international law instruments which are giving backing to the regime. We have to be able to say again, as was said of the League of Nations, that the United Nations is a thieves' kitchen. What alternative principles? If we're going to say, I'm going to say we're opposed on principle. Why should we be opposed on principle, irrespective of how legal or illegal it is, to an imperialist attack on Iran? Well, the principles I've put forward are basically two. The first is human solidarity. Working class solidarity. Human solidarity is a larger expression of working class solidarity. An attack on my comrade is an attack on me. An attack on my comrade is an attack on me. An attack on my brothers and sisters in another plant in the same industry is an attack on me. Dropping bombs on people in Tehran is an attack on me. That is the basic principle of working class solidarity. The second basic principle, Republican equality. Now, Bill referred to Marx's critique of distributive equality in the critique of the Gotha program. Distributive equality says everybody should get the same, we should all get a wheelchair. Everybody should get equal doses of antibiotics tomorrow. And that's the sort of equality the idea of equality which Marx is critiquing in the critique of the Gotha program. The idea of Republican equality is a different idea. It was one which was actually the idea of our forebears who fought in the both in the English Revolution and in the run-up to the American and French Revolutions, and in the Commonwealthmen who opposed the Whig regime in the 18th century. The idea is that it should not be the case that one person is in charge all their lives and other people have to do what they say all their lives. We should not have permanent relationships of domination and subordination. 18th century authors called that slavery, where you've got permanent relations in which some people are the bosses all the time and other people are subordinate to them all the time. Now, Republican equality became scandalous. And it became scandalous around 1800, and people saying, for God's sake, the opponents of equality were saying, this would mean that women could have a vote, that your barber might be allowed to intervene in political affairs or stand for public office. So Republican equality was an idea which the middle classes had as the way of running politics until the working classes came into the frame. And when the working classes came into the frame, Republican equality, the belief in Republican equality narrowed down, and it became an understanding which was actually only of the workers' movement. It was the understanding of Chartism. The whole of the program of Chartism is built on the idea of Republican equality, and that is reflected, in fact, in the political programs that Marx and Engels put forward in the Communist Manifesto, in the other documents put forward in Germany. And in fact, it's continuously present in the political interventions that Marx and Engels made in the second half of the 19th century. The idea of Republican equality as opposed to distributive equality It's reflected in the idea, again, the scandal. Bakunin says the trouble with the Marxists is that they believe that the political revolution has to come first and the social revolution afterwards. What that meant was that they believed that the working class had to take power, political power, and that taking political power involved basic Republican ideas, Republican egalitarian ideas. How does Republican equality relate to international affairs? Well, the answer is it's just as much true that we shouldn't have a regime in which Europeans, just because they're Europeans, get to tell people outside of Europe what to do, which is what the regime of colonial empires was. That Americans, just because they're Americans, always get to tell everybody in the rest of the world what they're about to do, allowed to do, can and can't do, shouldn't do, which is actually what the regime of the United States is. But equally, we shouldn't have a regime in which Farsi speakers get to tell Azeris, Kurds, etc., what they're allowed and not allowed to do. English speakers get to tell Welsh speakers what they're allowed to do and not to do. So that the principle of Republican equality, the idea of Republican equality as a fundamental groundwork, yields equality between nations. It yields equality between nations. How do you address that? Well, it's blindingly obvious that it's a violation of the principle of equality between nations as a political principle of democratic equality for the United States to drop bombs, as what is in substance being proposed is that Britain and the United States should drop bombs on Iran to compel Iran to do what the British and Americans want the Iranians to do, what the British and Americans want them to do. It's a clear, so there's an element of solidarity involved in opposing an attack on Iran. And that solidarity also leads us to solidarity with the Iranian workers' movement against the tyranny and oppression of the mullahs. And there's an element of Republican equality involved, that it's inegalitarian, that it's an attack on equality and democracy for the imperialists to attempt to impose their will on Iran by force. But that element of inegalitarianism is actually also a species of, is also present in the theocratic regime, that the theocratic regime imposes its will by force on the on the subordinate nations within Iran, etc. So these are general principles. Having said these general principles, I have said these are principles which can apply completely outside of and apart from law. I've said nothing about rights. I haven't said, and I don't need to say, whether Iran has a right to a bomb. I actually think that we should support those people in Iran who oppose the waste of the Iranian people's resources on efforts to acquire a bomb. We should oppose, I don't think Britain has the right to have a bomb either, and we should get rid of the bloody thing. It's manifestly the case, and it's a tremendous waste of British resources. It would be completely and utterly useless to us in any practical military conflict. That's equally that our own state is almost, it's a subordinate of the United States, but the United States and the British state together are the enemy of the world, peoples of the world. That's the word.
And the military strutting about now, wanting more.
Anyhow, so I'm not saying anything from that point of view. I'm using non-legal reasoning, I'm using non-rights reasoning, I'm using reasoning which actually doesn't depend on self-determination, because the principle of the equality of nations, although it's consistent with the self-determination, you can use it to justify self-determination. It's also consistent with power, with the Austro-Marxist or with Luxembourg, Austro-Marxist view or with Luxembourg's view in relation to that. Why do I not use that? So that's the positive side. I don't know, how long have I got?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. The negative side, why don't I use legal reasoning, human rights reasoning, international law reasoning or self-determination reasoning. István Mesheros, in his book Beyond Capital, makes, it seems to me, is a fundamental and profound point which affects the workers' movement. And that fundamental and profound point is that in the late 19th and 20th century, the workers' movement took the line of least resistance. The line of least resistance was to go down the road of national roads to advance its aims. Those national roads, on the one hand, was the Kautskyans and the right wing who go into supporting the existing bourgeois states, but also the Comintern after the first flush, after the first period of 1918 to 20, the Comintern also went down the road of national roads, of the seizure of power in individual countries. And Mesheros makes the point that capital is at the end of the day an international organism, and that going down the road of the line of least resistance led the workers' movement into a cul-de-sac. That cul-de-sac, of course, is Stalinism, the collapse of Stalinism, the extraordinary weakness of the international workers' movement since the collapse of Stalinism. Now, Mesheros's main example of that cul-de-sac is national roads. Because national roads, you get an isolated revolution, an isolated development in a single country, or for that matter, you take power, you join a government and take responsibility for running the capitalist state. But it's also true, in my opinion, that it's a line of least resistance to go down the road of defending legality, of attempting to turn legality into an instrument, of attempting to turn the discourse of rights into an instrument against the capitalist class. And I'm not going to, obviously I haven't got time to go into the depths of the detail about that, but the substance of what I'm arguing is that the concept, this concept of universal legality, of the rule of law, of the rule of rights, has at its heart the guarantee of the right of private property. The right of private property is at the heart and core of the charters which the bourgeoisie demanded of the feudal rulers throughout the Middle Ages, is at the heart and core of the Petition of Rights 1627, of the Bill of Rights 1689, and I think in practice also at the heart and core of the human rights instruments published since then. It's the guarantee of the right of private property which makes human rights instruments justiciable, which assimilates the rights which are given to rights of private property. But then the consequence of that, the guarantee of the right of private property, carries with it that the state is a joint stock. Point made by Tom Paine. The state is a joint stock company which people have voting shares proportional to their wealth. That voting shares proportional to their wealth carries the implication that the state, a rule of law state, will necessarily defend the interests of its big capitals. And in that context, actually, the natural outcome of the rule of law is for the US state to defend the interests of US capitals in ways which include making war on other states like Iran. So my opinion is that there are positive alternatives to using rule of law reasoning, but there are also negative reasons why we shouldn't use rule of law reasoning, because it is part of the phenomenon of the working class going down the line of least resistance into a cul-de-sac.
That's not postmodern, is what you said. Yeah,
okay.
There's a big difference. Okay.
Okay. I've got one speaker time is indicating we've got just over an hour. I obviously want to let the speakers come back now, so people could restrict the contributions to about 5 minutes. Thanks. Tammy and then John.
Yeah, thanks both of the speakers for contributions. I've just put some notes on here. I'm not reading that email. But just on a couple of things Mike said. You said whether Iran made a preemptive strike against Israel. I don't think we would. I think we would condemn that, and both the Iranian action and any response by the United States. Because I think solidarity with people in Israel who were killed in such an action is important, as important as people being killed in Iran for the U.S. action. So just to clarify that. I don't really understand, Mike. You go on this line talking about Republican equality between nations, and then say that sort of it's wrong to take a legalistic view of nation states and what they do. But I don't actually see what the difference is in the end game. Let me try to explain that. Marxists don't really believe that there is inequality between nations. We know there's not inequality between nations. And this is simply based on liberal notions of like international relations theory. That's what this is. This idea that all the nations are going to be equal eventually in sort of Kant's perpetual peace, you know, but they all have to be democratic nation states first. Of course, the definition of what a democratic nation state is based on what the most powerful states say it is. So, as you said rightly, you know, socialists believe in internationalism, and I'm just not sure that there is that this legality and rights are necessarily worse or better than each other. They're both languages that don't really encapsulate what Marxists and socialists think about the way the world works. So I just wanted to clarify that, but I don't necessarily agree that there's anything inherently wrong with using rights language, legality language, versus using language about equality of states, which we know in reality doesn't exist.
Okay, Sammy, John?
Yeah.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts to begin with. I mean, I agree with Mike that in terms of our attitude towards the United States, the United Nations, and this whole thing about international law, it does strike me that we want to reject that notion. Why? Because, as he said, well, okay, if Iraq was illegal, what happens if they make Iran legal? In other words, I don't think that we want to be trapped into that sort of, to use his phrase, that sort of cul-de-sac, that sort of dead end. On the other hand, I would also say that surely there's a difference, Mike, between, for example, campaigning for a law and legalism. In other words, if you take, for example, something like the 10-hour day or the 8-hour day, that's a perfectly legitimate demand for the working class to put forward, or a 35-hour week or a 30-hour week, etc. In other words, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It would be wrong, it would be stupid for us, I think, to take the view that because we reject legalism, because we refuse to be bound by legalism, we aren't going to fight to bind the employers or the government to certain laws. So, for example, if you take the government at the moment, it's trying to push through, isn't it, was it 42 days detention? We should be fighting for the, what was it, I'm not quite saying the Magna Carta, but you know what I mean. We should be fighting for no detention without charge, surely. That is a legitimate demand for the working class movement. You simply cannot be arrested without being charged for something. If they arrest you, we demand the body back. I think that's Old French or Latin or something along those lines.
Corpus,
there
yes.
you are, exactly my point. So what I'm trying to distinguish between is a particular law, which I think is quite legitimate for us to fight to, or for that matter fight to abolish, and a strategy that is legalism. I certainly agree that if you take a lot of the language and a lot of the strategy, at least of sections of Stop the War Coalition and other such types, yes, I think there's a danger of a cul-de-sac or a trap, worse than a cul-de-sac, worse than just a dead end. I think the danger is that we can actually be taken up the garden path, or down the garden path, or whatever you do with garden paths. I personally, I've read Rosa Luxemburg on this question of rights and all the rest of it. And she said, well, you might just as well demand the right to be, fed off a golden plate. Well, I sort of agree and don't agree, because again, just like with the demand around, we demand X law, what we're talking about here is not the deliverance of some utopia. We're not talking about this is the programme. What we're talking about, surely, when, for example, we demand the right to strike, we demand the right of Ireland to self-determination, we demand the rights of nations to self-determination. It's an aspect of our programme, it's a slogan, it's a crystallisation of something, it's not the end of it. Certainly, if it was the end of it, we get ourselves into all sorts of problems, we get ourselves into all sorts of idiocies. Because what we're then doing is establishing an abstraction. And what the Marxist programme is about, surely, is not an abstraction. It's about a programme of liberation. It's a strategy. And therefore, if we reduce it simply to slogans, we can be made fools of, and we indeed can make ourselves into fools in the process. So, for example, if you take the right of nations to self-determination, I think Rosa Luxemburg, in the context of whatever date one wants, late 19th century, early 20th century, her rejection, right, in the Congress kingdom, or in the kingdom, in the kingdom of, Poland, and the kingdom of Lithuania, thank you, I got it right, I think her rejection of that as a concrete demand by Polish social democracy was absolutely correct. In other words, what she was stressing, as Comrade Bill pointed out, was unity in the Russian Empire in order to overthrow Tsarism. On the other hand, I think Lenin actually, and I'm saying it in a, how should I put it, a metaphorical sense, sitting in Moscow, just be a couple of minutes, sitting in Moscow, okay, maybe in somewhere else like Switzerland, but you get the general point. Being a Russian was absolutely right also of saying, I, as a Russian, stand for the right of Poland to self-determination. But at the same time, I do not, as I think Bill was saying, stand for, as a positive question, as actually wanting to break up, how should I put it, the unity of Russian workers. He stood for the unity of Polish workers and Russian workers being in the same party in order to overthrow the Tsarist Empire. And when it came to, yes, fighting for the self-determination of Polish workers as part of the Russian Empire, he wanted them to fight for unity in a post-Tsarist state. That's my reading of it. So in other words, what?
I'm just asking to wind up.
Yes, I'm just about to. Okay. In other words, I don't think that we should treat these questions as absolutes. We don't want to trap ourselves in a programme of rights, neither do we want to trap ourselves in a programme of legalism. I think that will do.
Toby, and then Sherry.
Okay. I wanted, first of all, to say the obvious, that we completely oppose any attack and any excuse by US, UK or Israel on But on this question of absolute national self-determination, I'm afraid I don't accept it. And I mean, I think particularly if one looks back to Pol Pot's Cambodia as the most extreme instance, I cannot see how anyone could take the line which the United Nations took, but the United States of America took, that the Vietnamese intervention to overthrow Pol Pot was wrong. Maybe some of you think that was wrong. I mean, on a lesser scale, I think the Tanzanian intervention against Idi Amin's Uganda, I probably wouldn't go quite so far on that as I would on Vietnam into Cambodia, but another instance where I think you can say national self-determination is, if what you mean is the right of a tyranny to misrule its own people, including massacring large numbers of them, no. And I would also I'll say this, and I say this would say this to all left audiences, make me very unpopular. The bulk of them these days, but whatever mistakes were made by the Soviet Union when it went into Afghanistan, and whatever mistakes were made by the Afghan communists there, the Red Army was right to defend that regime, and the so-called resistance, the supporters of mullahs, landowners, obscurantism of all sorts, were wrong.
Thanks, Toby. Jerry, is there anybody else wanting to get to speak? And you don't know.
Just a few points on the rights of nations such as self-determination. It sort of depends a lot on what nation. For instance, Scotland you could define as some sort of an oppressed nation who definitely kind of defend its right, although you might advocate it. You'd be a lot more nervous, for instance, and some of the Balkan countries really don't like the sight of the Croatian flag flying as it does, or the Serbian flag. They have a right to self-determination, but in a lot of those Eastern European countries, the nationalism is tinged by the fact that the nationalism arose in the first place from the old feudal aristocracy. And it was the old feudal aristocracy that established the national character, and the national character can be quite oppressive and quite opposed to other people. In the Croatian sort of history during the Second World War doesn't bear accounting, and there is a lot of that in it, and also the fact that you can make a lot of criticisms of Tito and a lot of correct criticisms of the way he organized Yugoslavia, but at least he put that monster back in its box for a period, only to see it re-emerge. The other point I want to make about the right of nation determination is that there really is oppressed nations and oppressor nations in the world. And there's imperialist nations and there's semi-colonial nations. And in the war between an oppressor nation and a semi-colonial nation, you really do have to be for the defeat of the major imperialist power. And I would cite, for instance, the instance of the Malvinas. Had the British task force been defeated in the Malvinas, which I was certainly for at the time, you would not have had the re-election of the Thatcher government as you did have, and you would not have had possibly the defeat of the miners in the same way. The whole reactionary scenario that flowed from that was from the victory of imperialism in that war. Other people that were defeatist on both sides and everything said, well, look at the good thing that you had in Argentina, look at how the dictatorship was overthrown, wasn't that good? It is the consciousness of the world working class you have to take into account in all these circumstances. A defeat for a major imperialist power in a war is always the most progressive thing for the whole world working class that can happen. And you must be unequivocally for that.
Sorry, Krista?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why we are discussing sort of Lithuania, Poland, 1905, Russia, 1917.
So I've let you down the garden path stuff.
No, that's not true. Look, that's very
Hang on a second,
I'll just finish my
sure, that's a crucial stuff.
Excuse me, there's only one chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Somehow I thought it might be interesting to actually look at the question of war and humanitarian intervention in the context of Iran. Now, Jerry just said something pretty important, I think. He said, you have to understand that there is a distinction between an imperialist country and a colonial or semi-colonial country, and that in those conflicts, revolutionaries have a side, of course. This is not the same as an inter-imperialist war between Germany and France or Britain and US or whatever. We are looking at a possible scenario of an imperialist-led attack against Iran. And in that context, we say it is not of primary relevance what the nature or the reactionary degree of the leadership of that semi-colonial country is. We don't make a condition on having a democratic progressive government in place first before we allow them self-determination. No. We say imperialism, get the fuck out of that. And those people who fight against imperialism, we will militarily support. Just like in Britain, we will try and undermine the war machine in Britain or in the US. That is our contribution to defending the right of Iran not to be attacked and subjected by US imperialism. To me, that is a pretty straightforward question, really. And obviously, it is not a question of whether the war is legal or illegal. These are just considerations that really divert from the main issue, which is imperialism. And I noticed that in the leaflet that was put out for today, I guess, you say in the first paragraph, the main enemy is imperialism. I agree. And later on you say, we stand unconditionally against the warmongers of imperialism. Great. So if that is true, if indeed the main enemy is imperialism, then I would suggest that we take a side, or that Hopi would take a side, in that potential conflict between US imperialism and Iran. I don't see that codified in that leaflet, or towards the end of the leaflet anywhere, which side you would take. But I think that is a question you need to think through. Hopefully it's not going to happen in that situation, but I think for the sake of political clarity, what does it actually mean when you say the main enemy is imperialism? Does it have a consequence or not? Just to be against the war is kind of fine as long as it doesn't happen. And lots of people are against war, pacifists are against the war. But I would like to think that you take that statement, the main enemy is imperialism, serious, and come to a conclusion that is in line with that statement.
Okay, thanks for filling up my speakers list, Christoph. Guy there in the...
I'd just like to ask the speakers, slightly different tack from previous contributions. Is there any relationship between the domestic rights agenda and the international human rights agenda? Particularly, I'm thinking even sort of slightly trivial things like equal opportunities in the workplace and, I don't know, kids suing their parents. Is there any connection between, is it part of the same continuum, or is it completely separate? Because it's interesting, I mean, why I've posed this question to one or two people, I have been in the past perplexed by this obsession in the workplace with equal opportunities. I don't understand why employers are so keen on it, or at least it's counterintuitive. I've kind of got an idea now. And the way I posed it to people, I said, why is it that the bombers of Iraq are so concerned about equal opportunities at home? And that's how I provocatively, I've said this at work a few times. People always look at you really strangely. But to me, it's a serious question. Why is it that the same agencies are so absolutely concerned about domestic rights are doing another thing abroad? I'm just wondering if this, if you could help me out theoretically here, if this is part of the same thing.
Okay, Stan?
Yes, Stan Keeble from CPGB. I wanted to speak about yes, the revolutionary other side and about self-determination. The side, I mean, to answer Christoph, I can be the first in the queue. The side we're on is the side of the working class. There's the old slogan, no war but the class war. So in Iran, if there's a war between Iran and the United States and Britain and the United States on one side, shall we say, and Israel, who knows? Then our job, when our state goes to war, our job is to overthrow our state, isn't it? It's to raise the class struggle in our own state in order to reverse it, in order to overthrow it. And the same applies to the Iranian workers, the workers in Iran, I should say, because it's not multinational country, same as ours, is to organise to overthrow the state there. And it's the thing that will most help that is working class unity internationally. But the biggest contribution we could do towards helping the workers in Iran is to overthrow our state and get our state off its back. We don't take sides with, but by saying the main enemy is imperialism, we don't take sides with the Ayatollahs because that's the side which is against the workers of Iran, against the workers of the world. On self-determination, I was very interested in both the lectures actually. I always learn something from Mike when he speaks. I love it. And I've never heard Bill Bowring before, but I wasn't absolutely certain what you meant. I mean, the classic issue that comes up when we talk about self-determination is perhaps it was expressed by Jerry when he made his point just now. And he said he's in favour of self-determination, of the right of self-determination, but he's not sure whether he wants it to be exercised, right? Which brilliantly illustrates the usual, normal confusion on the question. Because self-determination can be exercised positively or negatively. It can be exercised for separation, or it can be exercised for unity. The idea that we're in favour of a world made up of separate nations, all nationalities in the world should form their own little state, and we'll have an equality of nations in that sense, and a permanent division of people. When you're born, you're stuck with it. If you're born an Englishman, you stay an Englishman all your life, and that's the end of it. You're not allowed to change. Right? Or, sorry. Yeah. To go out in the midday sun. So anyway, so there's a big difference between the right of self-determination and the right to independence, right? I mean, you can say you can exercise the right of self-determination to choose independence. We're against it in general, and we're in favour of it when it's unavoidable, when it's necessary to divide the working class. The world's working class, they want to be unified, and the fact that they're divided is a bloody shame that has to be overcome. The Tower of Babel, knocking the Tower of Babel down and causing multilingualism in the world was a curse, wasn't it, in the Bible? And that is the right way to understand it, I think.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I've got 3 more speakers. I'm going to close the speakers list and let the top 10 speakers come back. If anybody else wants to indicate, just let me know now. John, Steve, Pip, Nick.
I like Stan thought they're excellent introductions, and I think it's been a fascinating debate afterwards. It's the first time I've heard Mike talk about, or the first time I've heard the concept of Republican equality expressed in the terms that Mike has done so. So I'm not taking a position on it as yet, but I'd just like to probe it a little, perhaps. First, does that mean that we think the most urgent matter in international affairs is to create Republican equality between nations? And in that case, what demands would flow from that? Is that possible? I'm reminded of, there was a socialist action pamphlet of several years ago, about 2005 I think, which I presume Mike's old mate John Ross wrote, in which he said the most pressing issue facing the working class right now was to defeat US imperialism, and that the Chinese state was leading that struggle, and that if necessary a united front with more minor imperialist nations such as France and Germany, when they were in conflict with the United States, was a legitimate tactic for the working class to take. It seems that might actually flow from what Mike is saying. I completely oppose that, actually, because I think the key issue is the independence of the working class, and therefore, to some extent, relations between nations, I think, are subordinate to that. On what Christoph said, I agree. When you've got a colonial state, you support if one state is occupying another, if one state is oppressing another, you support not only the right of the oppressed or colonial state independence, but in most circumstances I would support independence. I support the breakup of the European empires. I think that was a correct thing to demand. But at the same time, what should the working classes in those colonial states do as far as their relations to other social forces there be? And I think that's a key issue as far as Iran is concerned. If the United States attacks Iran, and largely the United States has adopted an aggressive, with it's got sanctions against Iran, that you can say is war by other means. The United States has adopted a hostile posture towards Iran. What should the position of the working class in Iran be? I don't think it should be to give away its demands and say it's going to support the Iranian state in its struggle against US imperialism. I don't think, in any circumstance, the working class should agree to undertake class suicide in order to defend the right to self-determination. So I say the independence and the defence of the working class always comes first. And I wonder, and I'm probing what Mike said, and Bill can come in on that as well, as to what the implications for what Mike said are as far as what I think is the most important thing.
Okay, Phil and then Peter.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say as much as what Stan and Mike just said, except you use slightly different language. Nick, sorry. The thing about your approach to imperialism is you think entirely in terms of states. So you've got the American state against the Iranian state. And that's why you don't understand our position, because we take the side, not just of the working class in Iran, we take the side of the people of Iran. We don't want anybody to have bombs dropped on them, not just, so this is the question. What comes to us first is, what is the position of the working class, both in Britain and America, because we take the side of the American people, not the American state. Now, that's a different question. That it is a getaway that the traditional Trotskyist and left position is to look not at the question of peoples, but at the question of states, and that we need to get away from that. If the Iranian people can defeat the Americans and defeat the old Ayatollahs, then we're in favour of them defeating both. If there's a situation, it was raised this morning about the miners and not Adolf Hitler, it was Winston Churchill, wasn't it? Well, in actual fact, the interests of the working class were to get rid of Winston Churchill, but we also had to get rid of Adolf Hitler, and we were on the side of the miners getting a pay rise. These are all things that you have to deal with in a concrete situation. We may have chosen the wrong answer to that. Maybe we should have got rid of Winston Churchill immediately and gone over to a working class war against Adolf Hitler. We didn't take that deal.
He wasn't alive. It's more than alive.
So we make these decisions, and they're tactical decisions. You may get them right, you may get them wrong, but they're the kind of decisions that you have to make. And you've got a very rigid position.
Okay, Peter, then Steve.
Yeah, I mean, the question we have to ask ourselves is, why are we against imperialism? Because it seems to me that sections of the left see it as being opposed to imperialism as an end in itself, as the main issue at hand. But it's not actually. We oppose imperialism because it's the main obstacle to our positive cause, which is for the international working class. Yet, you get sections of the anti-imperialist movement who say they're for the victory of the working class, but at the same time believe that the struggle of the working class for its own emancipation should be suspended in order to defeat imperialism. Well, that's the one way around, isn't it? I mean, the imperialism is the main enemy of us. That's why it's the main enemy. It's the main enemy of our cause. So we're therefore not going to support another force, a state like the Iranian state, who might find itself on the receiving end of imperialism, but who is also as equally viciously against the international working class. Because that is not part of our cause either. For example, if you take the victory of Khomeini after the 1979 revolution, you can say certainly that the victory of a counter-revolution in Iraq, although it might have called itself anti-imperialist, it is certainly a tremendous setback for the working class in the whole of the Middle East, not just in Iran. So why on earth are we going to possibly support a regime that knows, well, that's what you're saying, take side. I don't think we should take a side, actually. If we had to choose, right, someone put a gun at my head and said, you must choose between the victory of US imperialism and then the victory of Tehran, I'd say, okay, I'd choose the victory of Tehran because I think that would lead to less disastrous consequences than the victory of US imperialism. But I don't have to choose. That's it, right? I've got my own independent mind. I choose the cause of the international working class. So I'm not going to take a side with our secondary enemy against our main enemy. Of course I'm not.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
Just a quick comeback on the point of Stan and Peter. I mean, for us, it's. I mean, Christoph talked about, you know, when you get involved in strikes and stuff, how you're doing things like blocking military equipment to the to the imperialists.
That's allowed.
That's okay. When you're engaging in sort of campaigns at home to block imperialist military equipment and stuff like that, what you're affected if there was a conflict going on between, say, US imperialism and the Iranian state, you'd be effectively, weakening US imperialism. So you would essentially be taking a side there, whether they're right or not. You're weakening, the imperialist force. I think it's perfectly consistent to say, militarily, we're going to take a side and we're going to block, the Iranian state in a concrete situation like that. It's perfectly consistent actually to make that statement. One of the things that I didn't understand from you is you were saying intervention in general is intervention into
all interventions.
So I just, in the context of if you've got, say, a worker state, something's come about, and I was just thinking of the context where that worker state's come about with surrounding states which might have quite reactionary castes and governments and so on, and say the peoples of that state are saying, well, we like the revolutionary gains in this state, we would like you to intervene to help us, kick out these reactionary governments, like the way that the Bolsheviks treated the neighbouring reactionary states to the US as well. I mean, intervention there by a revolutionary worker state, I think would be a perfectly supportive thing. And it work out quite well, so I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing.
Okay, thanks, Steve. John, and then I'm going to bring the top tables back in.
I'll be very quick. Just two things, really. I mean, I just wanted to pick up on that as well. I mean, partially agree with Steve, partially agree with Toby, actually. I mean, I think what I would be saying is, absolutely agree with you, Bill, no to imperialist intervention. I think that's a reasonable slogan, and I wouldn't have any argument with it. But actually setting it up as a total, absolute principle strikes me as wrong. You quoted the Russian Revolution in Finland. I mean, the tragedy, surely, of Finland is that the Red Army wasn't there to intervene against the White Army in Finland that was slaughtering the Reds. I don't know how many Reds died in Finland. Was it 100,000? It was a huge number, was slaughtered by the White Army. So in that sense, although I'm in favour of self-determination for Finland, I'm certainly not in favour of Finnish reaction slaughtering the Reds. And again, agreeing with Steve in that sense, whether you think it's right or wrong, tactically or strategically, the fact is that Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, all of them were in favour of intervention in Poland. Not because they wanted to take over Poland, but because they wanted to get to the German border to encourage the German Revolution. Whether that was right, whether it was wrong, you could say that history proved them wrong, but that wasn't, in my view, because of an absolute principle called non-intervention. My own view would be, you know, that if we look at the nations of Europe, depending on how you define the nations of Europe, but if, for example, the United States was using, I pick out a horrible country or so-called country, but Luxembourg, and we'd all voted for socialism in Europe, if you could do such a thing, well, sorry, the right of Luxembourg to self-determination, I don't know why I'm picking on Luxembourg, but for the right of Luxembourg to be a bridgehead, because it's small, we can bully it, but the right of Luxembourg, for example, to be a counter-revolutionary bridgehead for US imperialism, sorry. So these questions, I don't think, should be treated as an absolute. And I don't know about Bill, you sort of, I think, absolutised it. But Bill, obviously, will have to reply for himself. Last point, disagreeing with Steve, disagreeing with Christoph. Look, every meeting I've been to of this type, one Trotskyite comrade, or is it Trotskyist comrade, I can never remember, but one of these comrades gets up and tells us that of course we don't support these regimes militarily, we've got to support them, excuse me, the other way around, we don't support them politically, we've got to support them militarily. I think that's right. Comrades, look, I don't know about you, but I take my starting point really with the German soldier, philosopher Clausewitz, who was the basis for Marxism. War is the continuation of policy or politics by other violent means. And every time I hear you, comrades, support Argentina, Iran, wherever it happens to be, I don't notice your Kalashnikovs, I don't notice your armed formations. What I notice is copies of 1917 leaflets that are being given out. I call it propaganda. Even if you had your Kalashnikovs, that is a form of politics. But the reality of what you do is the same as us. We issue leaflets, we issue papers, we make speeches. Right? I wish I could have armed units, and if I did have armed units, and if I was in the concrete situation of Iran at the moment, and I had an armed unit, the last thing I would do at the moment, or at least thing I'd advise comrades like Yasmin and other comrades to do, is here's our armed unit, we go along to the Republican Guard, and we say, here are we communists, please set us up so we can shoot down some American planes when they come over. Because I'll tell you what will happen, comrades, concretely now, is the Republican Guards will say, thank you very much, comrades. Would you like to line up against this wall? And we'll shoot you. That is actually what would happen. Right? So I think it's, okay, it comes from Trotsky. I think it was a mistake by Trotsky from 1930 something. I know what he meant, but I think it was a mistake then. I think it's a mistake now. It's to cloud the issue, and in reality it's to be dishonest. Because really what we're doing is supporting politically. And I will not support politically the regime of the Ayatollahs. Yes, I don't have a problem actually saying, rather the defeat of US imperialism, right? Rather, of course we should campaign for that. Of course there's no contradiction in sabotaging the war industry. You quoted, the commentator quoted the miners. It didn't mean that the miners said, rather the victory of Adolf Hitler. Right? That's not what it was about. We do not need to take the side of the Ayatollahs. Our side is the working class. And the working class, of course, can enter into temporary alliances with all sorts of forces. Nothing in principle is ruled out. But concretely, when we're looking at the world today, when we're looking at the position of the working class, the last thing we should be advocating is a military, in other words, a political alliance with the Ayatollahs. It's suicidal, it's crazy, it's unnecessary. It's unnecessary for us here, it's madness and suicidal for comrades in Iran. We saw what happened in 79 to 81 as a result of that strategy. How many comrades in the left of Iran effectively were killed as a result of that line? Tens of thousands. The last thing they should do is repeat that mistake. Surely, comrades.
Okay, all right. Mike and Bill are going to respond now. I think you've both got plenty of notes there. I'm going to give you 10 minutes each to come back.
Okay. a series of bitsy points, I suppose, more or less inevitably. Tammy's point, when I say equality between nations, and I think this point was also raised by somebody else, Nick, when I say equality between nations, I do not mean equality between nation states. Yeah? Equality between nations is a line for the underlying position, yeah, which may imply the right of nations to self-determination, i.e. to separate and form a separate state, as a way of achieving equality between nations, but it may equally imply the rejection of discrimination within a single state, the equality of official languages within a single state. So back to this pre-14 debate, 1914 debate, Luxembourg, I think it was, said you can't possibly have, no, it was Kautsky said you can't possibly have multiple official languages. And Lenin responds to it, yes, of course you can have multiple official languages. They have multiple official languages in Sweden and in Belgium, and it's ridiculous to suppose that you can't have multiple official languages. Well, actually the logic of that, yes, you can have multiple official languages. You can have equality between nations within a single state. You know? That's, so what I'm saying is that the principle, we're talking about, and this is another issue in relation to Nick, we're talking about very much root level principles. When I say that one principle involved is class solidarity, yeah? One principle involved is Republican equality. We're talking about stuff which is right down at the roots of politics. And you have to go a level and a level and a level up before it becomes concrete, but it does become concrete in relation to opposing imperialism, among other things, because you oppose imperialism not just because, quote, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism and imperialism is therefore the main enemy, etc., etc., etc. Because it may turn out to be that the world systems theorists are right, and imperialism is not the highest stage of capitalism, but an endemic feature of capitalism which has been present from the beginning of capitalism and will be present until the end of capitalism. Yeah? So then it's not a good enough ground to oppose imperialism, that imperialism is capitalism in decay and therefore we're opposed to imperialism. We have to understand why, as a matter of principle, even if imperialism is terribly dynamic, advances the forces of production, develops capitalism, we're still bloody opposed to imperialism, and we're still bloody opposed to the oppression of one nation by another. And those reasons are right down at the deep roots of politics, which is what I was trying to get at. Preemptive strike, Tammy, I agree on. John, actually, I agree on strategy. I'm bending the stick against legalism, perhaps partly because I've just been reading Bill's book, which seemed to me to involve not exactly a strategy of legalism, but a strategy of advance within the frame of human rights concepts and international law concepts and the exploitation of the legal resources. Toby, I am just a tiny bit hesitant about, well, I'm certainly extremely hesitant about whether Tanzanian intervention in Uganda against Idi Amin was a great idea. I actually don't think that the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan involved any violation of the right of self-determination, because it was simply that they brought in troops as part of a faction fight within the in reality, the troops were already on the ground by invitation of the communist regime, which was certainly a domestically created communist regime. And they just used them in connection with the faction fight within the PDPA. And God alone knows whether Parcham or Kalk actually had a majority in that faction fight. So and I'm a little bit doubtful, not in the sense of, yes, the Cambodia, the Pol Pot regime is sort of one of the monstrosities of history, yeah, but whether the relationship between let's put it, the Vietnamese being great Viet chauvinists in relation to Cambodia and Laos, yeah, may be part of the process which produced the Pol Pot regime was one of the monstrosities of history in the first place. And then the fact that the Vietnamese intervened with military force actually may help not just US imperialism, but help the Pol Pot regime to survive as a terrorist force in the jungle for 10 years afterwards. That I think there are ambiguities about that. Back to defeatism and military support. Yeah, yes, comrades, where are the Kalashnikov? Yeah, but also, in fact, one of the sort of loci classici of Lenin's policy of defeatism is extensive polemic against Trotsky on the question in 1915. And he says to the percipient reader, this does not mean revolutionaries aiding the state by blowing up bridges, attempting to organise strikes against the war, immediately directly sabotage military equipment, and so on and so forth. So what does it mean? What does defeatism mean when he says that? If it doesn't mean blowing up bridges, sabotaging the military effort, and so on, actually he's very clear about what it means. It means carrying on an anti-war agitation, and continuing to carry on an anti-war agitation. It's in the face of its illegality, in the armed forces, attempting to persuade the armed forces to become defeatist. Yeah? And in fact, he goes on and he says, it's a policy for the united action of the workers' movement of the socialists on both sides of the war to induce the soldiers to fraternise with each other and turn their guns on their officers. That's what the nature of the policy of defeatism is. Yeah? And to be honest, that has absolutely nothing. That policy has literally less than nothing to do with what the orthodox Trotskyists, or rather the Spartacist wing, it never used to be an orthodox Trotskyist position until the Spartacists developed it as a fetish to beat up the American SWP with, at a time in 1968-9 when the American SWP was practically assisting very concretely and practically in the defeat of the United States in Vietnam by building a mass anti-war movement on the basis of bring the troops home and no other demands whatever.
Bring our boys home. Doesn't bring our boys home.
Doesn't bloody matter, doesn't in the least matter, you know. It's, so this, as far as the question is of Iran is concerned, my object in my original intervention, in my original speech, my object...
No, you did quite well. You did quite well.
Yeah.
Can
you take that song, please? I'm sorry. Vicky.
The comrade at the front here, sorry, Dave. I think there is actually a connection in the sense that it's undoubtedly the case that human rights, humanitarian intervention has become one of the major means which the bourgeoisie, the international capitalist class, uses to justify imperialist wars. Yeah? And that carries with it the paradox is the fact that you're doing that. It started with Jimmy Carter. In fact, Jimmy Carter launched the human rights, US human rights assault on the basis of this was going to be the killer which knocked the Russians out of the picture. Yeah? And the trouble is, from the point of view, there is a contradiction. That if you're going to do that at the level of international politics, you have to make concessions to it at the level of national politics. And indeed, actually, the Americans had to make concessions at the level of the form of their control of Latin America, that they gave up on all the military regimes which they'd been supporting up to that time in order to put in place these fake parliamentary regimes. You know? So you have to make, there is always a contradiction. But my problem with it, and it is perfectly possible, it's entirely legitimate to exploit the contradictions. It's entirely legitimate for the working class to make demands for things to be brought into law. Yeah? No problem with the working class making demands for things to be brought into law. The problem is that we have to get across an understanding of the principles. And that the principles at the end of the day, right down at the bottom, the principles at the end of the day are not about rights principles and are not justiciable, are not things which you could go. You can't substitute going to courts for political action designed to persuade people to vote different ways, to go on strike, to refuse to serve in military service, whatever it may be. Yeah? And there's been too much, it seems to me, of the left, and I won't say the far left in this sort, because the far left mostly is just completely blindly economist and completely ignores questions of the laws and rights and all of this stuff. But of the traditional left, there has been too much of, okay, we're going to shift our attention into battles over rights, battles in courts, at the expense of political action. Yeah? I'm trying to bend the stick to some extent against that.
Well, it's great to be in a room full of communists, so all of you have a point of view and you've all expressed them, so that is excellent. I'm going to take a few things which have come out of the discussion. First of all, on the question of intervention. And first of all, what I'm meaning by intervention is the intervention by us, about which we hear all the time. So we have to intervene to stop this terrible situation in Darfur or wherever it might be. And so that form of intervention, I think, is absolutely impermissible. I think that, not to be nuanced, but I think there's a very clear distinction between intervention in that sense and support. And I just actually wanted to, unless I misunderstood you on Finland, my understanding of Finland is the following, that the very sharp struggle in Finland immediately after the revolution was between the Reds, who supported Finnish independence, and the Whites, who wanted to keep Finland within the Russian Empire. And I've been in Helsinki and seen where this took place. And, you know, the absolutely clear distinction was between the Bolsheviks, for whom the principle was Finnish independence, and the Whites, who wanted to keep it within the empire. And I think one of the paradoxes of what then happened with Stalin is that actually, quite contrary to Lenin's position, Stalin was in favor of maintaining and then pushing out the boundaries of the Tsarist Empire. So on the question of support, I think one of the burning issues back in the 60s and 70s, and it still is the question of support for national liberation movements. And I think one of the absolutely fine examples of this was, as a matter of fact, Libya, which gave unstinting support to the ANC and PAC in South Africa. And I think this was fully recognized at the time. And I don't think anyone on the progressive or indeed communist side of things could have possibly said that that kind of support was some kind of impermissible intervention. And of course, you know, right the way through the history of the Bolsheviks, and I would say the contradictory nature of Soviet foreign policy and approach to international law, was enormous material support given to national liberation movements and decolonizations throughout the world, as a matter of fact. I think thoroughly contradictory, but that's how it was. Your question here about what's happening with equality of opportunity and this kind of thing in this country. We do live in a colonialist country. This is a center of imperialism. And I think what's happening in relation to Iran is exactly part and parcel of that. Forgive me for just a few words of autobiography. Somebody mentioned the Falklands. I do very distinctly remember that. And of course, Thatcher embarked on that particular adventure at the point where she had become extremely unpopular, but where she had also announced some years previously that she had two main targets. One was the trade unions, the other was local government. And I speak from a little bit of experience, as I was one of the Lambeth councillors who was surcharged in 1986. And so, you know, that was the miners' strike, and that was the smashing of Liverpool and Lambeth, and indeed the retreat, really, of the whole of the movement on both sides. And we now live in a country where the right to strike is very seriously curtailed, where unions have, ever since then, been really fighting to survive in many ways. Therefore, I think when one hears about equality of opportunity coming from anybody in a governmental position, what you're listening to is absolute, complete hypocrisy. And I think that's part and parcel of the allergy of this country to social and economic rights, to the extent that they have been established internationally. I think actually a very progressive call in this country is to say, you know, why doesn't this country move into the 20th century in relation to social and economic and trade union rights? And I'll say something more about that in 2 seconds. Actually, you know, I'm a lawyer, so forgive me for that. So, and I think each of us tries to do things within our own particular sphere of activity. And so the law is certainly not the be-all and end-all, but I think it does play quite an important role, as do issues of rights. I think in particular as a legitimating factor in struggle and a mobilizing factor. So Comrade mentioned the English Revolution, and one of the main, if you like, slogans of the English Revolution was the struggle to protect Anglo-Saxon freedoms against the Norman yoke. You know, if you've read your Christopher Hill and so on, this was a very important mobilizing factor. Actually, Trotsky writes about this very well, as a matter of fact, I think in his work on Britain, where is Britain going and so on. And I think that's one of his best bits of writing, as a matter of fact. And the Soviet Union, which I would criticize on many different levels. However, as we well know, the Soviet Union was not overthrown by a revolution. It collapsed. I mean, in many ways it rotted, and I would say the rot set in a long way back. However, why wasn't it overthrown by a revolution? I would say that it was legitimated to a very great extent by the fact that the Stalin Constitution and then the Brezhnev Constitution had chapters on human rights, in which right number 1 was the right to work, and as a matter of fact, everybody had a job in the Soviet Union. Rights number 2, 3, and 4 were free education, free healthcare, pensions, social security, annual holiday, and that kind of, and housing, which is why that whole area is blighted by horrific apartment blocks. But anyway, the state was trying to deliver, and as a matter of fact, the state did deliver on many of those commitments that were given as rights. And so I would say that that was an extremely important legitimating factor. On the question of Republican equality, I think this is a great revolutionary slogan for Britain. As I say, you know, Britain moves with great difficulty into the 18th century. When you read Tom Paine, this is a revolutionary tract for today in Britain. You know, we live in a monarchy of the most reactionary type, where we have a government which is able to go into adventures like Iraq, which is, I mean, illegal, we all agree. But also, what the hell are we doing? You know, why are we repeating colonial adventures in Iraq and in Afghanistan, as I said earlier? What are we up to? And I think a lot of this is to do with the fact of a country, as a matter of fact, where, you know, why is Tom Paine still so relevant? So I say I'm all for Republican equality in Britain. Why not? I think that's a great revolutionary slogan. And so finally, what I want to say about rights, really, I've already mentioned how I think rights can be a legitimating factor and a mobilizing factor. What I would also say about human rights, of course, with the first generation of the French Revolution, private property is central, but I think things moved on a bit since then. And if those rights were scandalous at that time, for various reasons, I would say that the right of peoples to self-determination coming out of decolonisation, a process which is absolutely not completed. So, and I mentioned I'm taking cases on behalf of Kurds, on behalf of Chechens, and others. I would say these are both examples of processes which are still not worked out and extremely live. By the way, just to mention the Malvinas Falklands situation, I had a very strange experience in 1983 of going on behalf of Amnesty International to Madrid to be an expert witness in a trial of Basque councillors. And the Basques actually were fully in support of Britain because Madrid was in favour of Argentina. And so I gave an extremely difficult interview to the main Basque newspaper. And actually I'm very much involved with the Basques at the present time. And I think they have a very good and legitimate cause, as a matter of fact, in relation to Spain. particularly when you look at the history in the Franco period and so on. But, you know, I think this just indicates that the world is quite complicated. I would say that, and what is so impressive, I think, with Marx, Engels, Lenin, and so on, is that they did take sides on issues, and quite often it's difficult to decide where exactly you come down and how you do it precisely, but I think that's really important. Final word is this, that my take on rights, so in one sense, of course, I'm trying to justify to myself and to others what I'm doing as a human rights lawyer, so that I'm sure that means doing. So my take on rights is that they have, as I tried to point out, a revolutionary origin in the English, American, French and Russian revolutions in particular. And I would say that although they are constantly abused and treated as rhetoric and used as covers for all manner of abuses, that nonetheless they come back to life when they acquire the content of real struggles. And I would say this happens all the time, as a matter of fact. That's why it is still worth, I think, exploring, using, if you like, inhabiting some of these ideas. Thank you.